Hello, my name is Kevin Kennedy, and I'm working with the Yucca Mountain team. The portion of this project that I'm going to be speaking about today will be the history of Yucca Mountain, why there's a need for the site, where the spent fuel is stored now, and I'll also be covering the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 and the Energy Policy Act signed in 1992. The history of Yucca Mountain begins with the birth of the nuclear age. The discovery of ionizing radiation in the late 1890s led to the first experimentally confirmed fission during the late 1940s. Unfortunately, this is the time of World War II, so most of nuclear power's early development was directed towards the atomic bomb. In 1946, Harry S. Truman created a federal agency. It was called the Atomic Energy Commission. This federal agency was to manage the development of nuclear energy for military and civilian applications. This led to 1951, which was the first nuclear reactor was able to produce a small amount of electricity. The experimental breeder reactor, EBR-1, was developed and operated by the Argonne National Laboratory in Idaho. It wasn't until 1953 that President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposed Atoms for Peace, and it was to direct the research of nuclear energy towards electricity generation. Now, with all of these early reactors and early experimental experiments with nuclear power, the problem that developed was highly radioactive, long-lived waste. The Atomic Energy Act was passed by Congress in 1954. This act is the fundamental U.S. law on both the civilian and military uses of nuclear materials. It stated that the development, use, and control of atomic energy shall be directed so as to promote world peace, improve the general welfare, and increase the standard of living and strengthen free competition in private enterprise. One of the most important directives of the Atomic Energy Act was that the responsibility for disposal of waste product from nuclear material and power would be on the federal government. The National Academy of Sciences proposed a solution to waste products of nuclear power to the Atomic Energy Commission in 1956. They proposed that they could take this nuclear waste and it could be buried deep within salt and rock deposits for decay. What this did was it set the Atomic Energy Commission on a research path for such a site. In 1960, the Atomic Energy Commission found a site in an abandoned salt mine in Lyons, Kansas. Now, unfortunately, after they did some more research, they found out that this site contained boreholes which they were trying to find gas and oil, and that would affect the integrity of a national repository. This led to the abolishment of the Atomic Energy Commission, and they created the Energy Research and Development Administration, and this was created by the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974, and it was signed into law by President Gerald R. Ford. This act created the Energy Research and Development Administration and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It seems that the Atomic Energy Commission, having both the promotion of nuclear power and then regulating of nuclear power, it was too much for just one commission. So in 1975, this administration began multiple site surveys in 36 states, and they're prioritizing buried salt deposits and federal nuclear facilities as possible locations for a national repository. Nevada was included in this search, and Yucca Mountain was one of the sites that was named as a possible location. This brought about the Department of Energy Act, which was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1977. What this did was it placed the Department of Energy in the executive branch, and it also created the Office of Secretary of Energy, and they worked alongside the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. At this point, it's when deep geological disposal was selected as the preferred method for permanent disposal of nuclear waste, which brought about the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. This was signed in by President Ronald Reagan on January 7th in 1983. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act had 5 functions. The 5 functions are: it created a waste site screening process, and the second function required that 2 repositories would be built for regional equality. It also set a schedule leading to waste acceptance by the federal government to begin in 1998. It established a nuclear waste fund, which would be attached to consumers' electric bills to pay for it, pay for a national repository, and a license requirement from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for repository sites. In 1986, the Department of Energy nominated 5 site locations, including Yucca Mountain, in a final assessment. They also indefinitely postponed the second siting, so they ended up violating the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which did lead to some lawsuits. This act was actually amended in 1987, saying that Yucca Mountain would be the only selected site for a national repository. It also banned the research of repository sites in granite, so that way it turns out that Yucca Mountain, as a western site in the state of Nevada, would be selected because eastern and northern sites that were selected contain granite. This brought about the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which actually opened more windows for nuclear power. The goal of the Energy Policy Act was to increase clean energy use, lessen the nation's dependence on imported energy, and increase overall energy efficiency. The portions of the Energy Policy Act that actually dealt with nuclear power were in the 800 sections. Section 801 assigned the Academy of Sciences and the Environmental Protection Agency to conduct a study to develop site-specific public health and safety standards for Yucca Mountain. They also had to do a study for post-closure oversight of the repository that could be developed based on active institutional controls that will prevent an unreasonable risk of breaching the repository's engineering or geologic barriers or increase the exposure of individual members of the public to radiation beyond allowable limits. So basically what that stated was that post-closure of the site, it would still remain safe over a period of 10,000 years. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Academy of Sciences set the standards for radiation protection, and they tasked the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to set license requirements based on these standards. Section 803 required the Secretary of Energy, along with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency, to submit a report on the adequacy of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. Specifically, they wanted to state that new nuclear power plants construction and their refuel and nuclear waste generated, that the Nuclear Waste Policy Act would account for those additional volumes of generated waste. It was at this time that the actual construction of the Yucca Mountain repository site began. They started with the Department of Energy holding public hearings for the plans for Yucca Mountain in 1988. They began surface studies of Yucca Mountain in 1991, and they finally started with grading work for the first phase of the Exploratory Studies Facility in 1993. They also realized at this time that they were not going to be able to make the deadline of 1998 for the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. So they developed an interim plan that would accept waste with the use of multi-purpose canisters. And they also reassessed that they would not be able to accept waste at Yucca Mountain until 2010, which they also later found out that they would not make, which will be covered in a different portion of this project. So in 1994, the construction of the portal entrance to the Exploratory Studies Facility began with tunneling in the Yucca Mountain. They ran into some trouble with some loose ground, but they still had plans to have 5 miles of tunnel area completed by 1996. In 1997, they began with thermal testing of the site, with a scheduled completion lasting 8 years. By the time 1998 rolled around, the Department of Energy, they did fail to meet their deadline according to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This did lead to many lawsuits from the nuclear power facilities and the states. It wasn't until 2002 that Yucca Mountain finally began to make headway. In 2002, Spencer Abram, who was the Secretary of Energy, he gave his official recommendation to President George Bush, and they signed into law that the Yucca Mountain repository site would be the national nuclear waste repository. Unfortunately, at this time, that the Department of Energy still had some more problems. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they identified 293 issues that the Department of Energy would have to address before they could submit an application for a repository license for Yucca Mountain. Well, they're still fighting today, and Yucca Mountain is still not accepting waste. So this brings into question, what is the current solution for radioactive waste? Currently, the U.S. produces 2,000 metric tons of used fuel from its 100 commercial nuclear facilities every year. In the past 50 years of nuclear operation, commercial plants have produced 71,790 metric tons of used nuclear fuel. Most of this fuel is stored on site at nuclear facilities. They store it in storage pools. The fuel is stored in at least 20 feet of water, and it's moved into the pools along the bottom of water canals, which will provide sufficient amount of shielding. Unfortunately, many commercial sites are running out of storage capacity, so the only other solutions we have at this time are dry containers and re-racking. Re-racking is a process of taking spent fuel that is stored in storage pools and moving it close together. It's subject to review and approval by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it often involves expensive high-density storage racks constructed with neutron-absorbing panels. It's an interim solution because these facilities, without the completion of Yucca Mountain, will eventually run out of room. Our other option that we currently have is dry storage containers. They're constructed out of large steel or steel reinforced concrete. A storage container is able to store 87 fuel assemblies from boiling water reactors or 37 fuel assemblies from pressurized water reactors. They are licensed for 20 years and may be extended for an additional 20 to 40 years. The problem with these storage containers is the cost. The construction of them costs between $10 and $20 million and has an operational cost between $5 and $7 million annually. That's for the facility and the security and the monitoring of these dry storage containers. Unfortunately, this will reflect on the consumer's electric bills because it's not included in the nuclear waste fund from the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. The first dry storage installation was licensed at the Surrey Nuclear Power Plant in Virginia in 1986. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Energy, says that this fuel can safely be stored at nuclear power facilities or in a central storage facility for 120 years, but this was never intended to be a permanent solution. Another thing that they're looking at or looking into or studying is they're studying the recycling of used nuclear fuel. This would allow the recovery of a lot of nuclear power and nuclear fuel to create more power, and it would lessen the amount of waste that we would produce. Unfortunately, this is not a permanent solution also because you would still have highly radioactive byproducts. They would not be eliminated, and a permanent geological repository would still be needed. Yes. So this concludes my section that I'm going to be talking about. Thank you for watching.